right, so we're picking up in our notes with this page here. The last thing that you should have in your notes is some things about Andrew Carnegie, and we ended with the Gospel of Wealth. Of course, we read a little bit about his philosophies. You had to answer some questions. We went over that. So, as I said, we're going to use two specific individuals, Andrew Carnegie being one of them, to help us understand and use them as examples to help us understand the hundreds of wealthy, powerful industrialists of the era, to help us understand the way that businesses in general and business leaders in general worked. But in order to do that, we do want to use these two specific examples. So we have one more that we want to cover, and that second business leader is hopefully another name that should be at least somewhat familiar to you, not necessarily because of the local connection with Pittsburgh and Andrew Carnegie, but there is even a local connection. But hopefully it's just a name that you recognize because it's a piece of our cultural literacy here in the United States. It's a name that is synonymous with this era, but has sort of been a part of our history forever, well, at least since this era, and that is J.D. Rockefeller. So hopefully the name Rockefeller is familiar to you. And just like Andrew Carnegie, his name, the Rockefeller name, is attached to many other things out there, including Rockefeller Center in New York City. There has been ancestors of his since this era that have served in government, that have been political leaders, candidates. There have been business leaders that have carried on his tradition. So anyway, hopefully that name is familiar. We're going to learn about J.D. Rockefeller and what he did in this era of growing business and industry after the Civil War. So, Andrew Carnegie is to the steel industry as J.D. Rockefeller is to the oil industry. And those are two of the industries that we mentioned earlier in our studies as well, so we're kind of using them as examples of what was happening in all of the businesses and industries. These just happen to be two of the big ones at the time, right? All right, so we know that, I guess here's a local connection with Rockefeller. We know that Edwin Drake discovers a way to successfully, efficiently extract oil from beneath the Earth's surface in Titusville, Pennsylvania, right down the street, right? And when that happened, we know that it created an oil boom, not just in this region, but really eventually that spread throughout the entire country. Well, much like Andrew Carnegie saw the future of steel once Bessemer invented the Bessemer converter, J.D. Rockefeller saw a future with this oil business. And so he starts to get involved. He, like Carnegie, was already making his way in the business world. He was a Cleveland guy. He was working in the produce business in Cleveland. Made a lot of money during the Civil War because the companies that he worked with were doing a lot to ship and provide food to Union soldiers. So anyway, he takes this money that he has already started to make during the Civil War years, and he starts to turn to this oil industry. And in 1870, he creates his Standard Oil Company. The Standard Oil Company, believe it or not, didn't actually produce and sell oil. What it did was it took oil and it refined it into kerosene. And so kerosene now had burst onto the scene as this new fuel that was going to fuel this industrial revolution of the time, and he was going to be the leader in producing and selling kerosene. He is so good at it, kind of like Andrew Carnegie became with his steel production. J.D. Rockefeller becomes so good at producing kerosene that he, like the other business leaders of this social Darwinistic era, wanted to find ways that he could drive his competitors out of business and then rise to the top. Remember that idea of survival of the fittest. And he was doing it. He was able to undersell his competitors. He was able to make his kerosene, produce it, sell it, ship it, manufacture it, the whole deal, way more efficiently and cheaply than his competitors could. And so he could undersell them, and so he did. He undersold his competitors to the point where people were going to buy his kerosene and nobody else's. If he could do that, he wanted to drive his competitors out of business. Now, at the time, by the time we get into the 1870s, and we're already into this era of this laissez-faire, hands-off, social Darwinistic economic period, we start to see some rules, regulations, some laws being established by the government to sort of kind of govern some of the economic practices that were starting to happen. And there were laws and rules and regulations out there that were prohibiting Andrew Carnegie's Standard Oil Company from completely buying out and underselling it and eliminating his competitors. So he had to try to find ways around those laws, because if you're an Andrew Carnegie or a J.D. Rockefeller of this era, the government isn't going to tell you what you do. You're going to tell the government how it's going to work. That was the way that these wealthy, powerful captains of industry / robber barons worked. And so he turned to Samuel Dodd and others, who was a lawyer that worked for Rockefeller, and he said, listen, we need to figure out a way for me to get around these laws and these regulations, to find loopholes where I can buy out, drive out, eliminate my competitors. And so he, Samuel Dodd, and others that put their brains together to try to figure out a way to do this, come up with the idea of what becomes known as the trust. And that's why we see the Standard Oil Trust. Eventually, his Standard Oil Company will become the Standard Oil Trust. What happens is this. The loophole that they discover and they create or invent, I guess, on some level, is to not buy out and eliminate the other businesses that are trying to compete, but instead find a way to force them to merge together into one big, what we call conglomerate company. So basically, J.D. Rockefeller goes to these smaller mom and pop type kerosene businesses and these oil companies, and he says, listen, yeah, there's rules and regulations that are keeping me from buying you out and eliminating you. But I'm J.D. Rockefeller. I'm going to figure out a way to drive you out of business. But I'm going to give you a choice before I do that. Why not merge with my company? And we'll put all of these companies together, and we'll create one giant company that can take over the world, or at least the kerosene world, the oil world, right? Well, if you're a small oil company, and you're faced with two choices: try to continue competing with the great J.D. Rockefeller and Standard Oil, or merge your company and keep it alive and somehow keep yourself involved. It's a pretty easy choice. And so what happens is in 1882, I'll come back to horizontal integration in a second, 40 companies merged together to create this massive conglomerate company called the Standard Oil Trust. And the trust became the loophole. And this was a way that many companies start to follow their lead, figure out ways to take over their industries. Now here's the thing, we're gonna have 40 small companies come together and join together into this Standard Oil Trust, this one big giant company. And it's gonna be run by a board of trustees. Well, we're gonna have a president of the board of trustees. Who do you think that's going to be? Of course, that's going to be J.D. Rockefeller, who is going to sit and govern this massive conglomerate trust that he created. And in that way, he was able to work around the rules and the regulations to figure out a way to still take control of all of the other companies in the entire oil industry. And that's essentially what he did. It's at one point, Rockefeller, much like Andrew Carnegie did with steel, Rockefeller controls almost the entire oil industry in the entire world. And he is the guy that is producing kerosene for the masses. Other businesses will follow suit, and you will start to see the formation of these trusts in all kinds of different businesses. Now, eventually, the government will step in over time and start to pass laws and regulations to stop the trusts from taking over and driving their smaller businesses out of business as well. Talk more about that later. Okay, so there's a little bit about J.D. Rockefeller and the Standard Oil Trust. Now, what he did was slightly different than what Andrew Carnegie did. Not what they did, the way they did it. What they did in the end kind of is the same result. They find ways to totally monopolize and take control of their entire industry, right? Andrew Carnegie used what we learned the other day, vertical integration. And let's put them both up here on the slide. So we can look at these two different strategies. One we already have in our notes. We're going to add vertical integration. If you didn't already, we're going to put it right here. So we can see the two different strategies that they used. With vertical integration, which is what Andrew Carnegie did, we learned that he controlled every step in the process of making steel. He owned the coal mines. He owned the coke ovens. He owned the Bessemer converters. He owned the equipment. He owned the factories. He owned the rail cars that shipped it, and so on and so forth. He didn't want to have anybody else involved. He didn't want to have to pay anybody for a product or a service. He wanted control of the whole thing. J.D. Rockefeller did a little bit differently. He wasn't necessarily interested in all of the facets of kerosene production. He wasn't concerned with owning the oil derricks and drilling for the oil and pulling it out of the ground. He didn't care about that. He was willing to purchase the oil from other companies, but what he did want to do was take all of the small businesses that produce the same product, in this case kerosene, and he wanted to combine them all together into one massive conglomerate trust, as he called it, and then he would sit on top of it. So that's what we call horizontal integration, combining many firms in the same business to create one single unit, and it becomes known as the trust, the first being the Standard Oil Trust. All right, so the end result, it's the same philosophy, it's the same idea. In the end, they both want control of their business and their industry. The two of them, and then different business leaders in different businesses, went about it with different strategies. So there you go. All right, now, I'll come back to that cartoon. So I like to end this discussion of these two examples that we're using. We used Andrew Carnegie and J.D. Rockefeller and learned a little bit about what they did. I like to pull it all together and talk about the way other people reacted to what these men were doing. So here we have a few bullet points about the public reaction to these big businesses, to these robber barons and these captains of industry, these big companies. Ultimately, the general feeling eventually among most people in the country was a negative feeling. The public essentially disliked these big, powerful trusts and monopolies and conglomerates that were being formed and that were becoming so powerful and so wealthy. A lot of it because the average person, the worker, the consumer going out there and spending their money for these products and these goods, really, in most people's opinions, wasn't what the focus was anymore. And these big, powerful Carnegies and Rockefellers didn't care much about the workers and the consumers. However, the public's reaction isn't enough to stop it. This becomes the way of the world in the time period. Mergers, conglomerates, monopolies, trusts, they become the driving force for our country in this era. And in many ways, there's a lot of positive to it because I said at the beginning of this chapter, in many ways, the world we live in today and the standard of living that we have and the technologies that we all have, for goodness sake, we all have these little, I don't have it, it's on my desk, these little computers in our pockets, right? That world that we get to enjoy today here as Americans, in many ways was created by these men and this era and what they were doing. However, there's a downside to it because they did that at the expense of workers in their factories and mills, at the expense of the consumers who were the ones that were spending their hard-earned money to purchase these goods and products and things. So these powerful conglomerates, these trusts, these monopolies become very corrupt. They become so wealthy and powerful that I always say, and many historians would agree with this, they were the ones that were calling the shots. They were the ones who were in charge. They were the ones that were running the country. We'll learn a little bit more about the presidents of the era and the government of the time. We know that it became very corrupt. We already talked about that in the Reconstruction period. It really was the Andrew Carnegies and the J.D. Rockefellers that were basically ruling the world. Now, I said that Andrew Carnegie and J.D. Rockefeller and others found loopholes, like the formation of the trust, around the different rules and regulations. Well, as that was happening, then the government would step in and try to make other rules and regulations to try to eliminate some of the corruption. In 1890, one of the big pieces of legislation was the Sherman Antitrust Act. This was passed as a way to try to stop these trusts from forming. But what I can tell you in the early days of the Sherman Antitrust Act is that it was very loosely enforced, if enforced at all. And think about it. The ones who were creating legislation like the Sherman Antitrust Act, the government, they were in cahoots with and in the pockets of the very business leaders that these regulations were trying to stop and affect. So the corruption really got to a point where the rules and regulations were overlooked anyway. Ultimately, this time period after the Civil War and up to 1900 and even into the early 1900s, these late 1800s, we saw economic ups, economic downs. We saw great times, we saw depressions over this time period. But in the end, what we really saw was that the goods and the bads and the highs and the lows and the ups and the downs that our economy always goes through really didn't hurt the J.D. Rockefellers and the Andrew Carnegies of the world. Who did they hurt? When things were good, it was good for everybody. But when things were bad, it was bad for the working class average citizen. Didn't get very bad for the rich, powerful business leaders. And as that goes on for so long, where we see the discrepancy between the lives of these wealthy, powerful business leaders and the lives of the working class average American, as that continues to exist throughout the era, eventually something's got to give. And eventually, we're going to talk about what it was like to be on the other side of that. That's what you have to look forward to when we talk next time about the industrial workers.